In the middle of the darkened North Atlantic, the USS Gerald R. Ford cuts through the freezing swell alone. To the horizon, there is only black water. For decades, this American Titan would have been flanked by a protective ring of steel. British Type 45 destroyers, French multi-mission frigates, and German corvettes. But tonight, the escorts are gone. The horizon is empty, and the silence is deafening. What if the phone call that has held the world together for 80 years simply wasn't answered? It is the year 2020X, and the Great Schism has just begun. As a sudden, violent maritime crisis erupts in the Persian Gulf, threatening to choke the world's energy supply, Washington reaches out to its oldest friends. They expect the usual: a joint statement, a coordinated strike group, a show of unbreakable resolve. Instead, they find a wall of silence. The emergency lines between the Pentagon and the ministries in London, Paris, and Berlin remain cold. The diplomatic cables are returned to sender. For the first time since the end of the Second World War, the leader of the free world is left waiting on the line. Then comes the declaration that shatters the pillars of the modern age. From the heart of Europe, the word goes out: strategic neutrality. In the face of a hot conflict, the European Union has decided it is no longer an ally. It is a spectator. This is the moment the Western world as we know it ends. Not with a bang, but with a cold, calculated withdrawal. The transatlantic alliance, the most powerful military and economic pact in human history, has just collapsed. And as the lights go out in the halls of NATO, a new, much darker timeline begins, one where America stands entirely alone. To understand how the world broke, we first have to understand the bargain that held it together for nearly a century. Since 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was the bedrock of global stability. It was a simple, brutal contract defined by Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. Under this security umbrella, Europe was allowed to flourish, building massive social safety nets and high-tech economies, while the United States provided the heavy lifting: the nuclear shield, the global satellite networks, and the carrier strike groups that kept the sea lanes open. But the cracks in this foundation have been visible for years. In our reality, we've heard the friction. American leaders demanding Europe pay its fair share of defense spending, and French President Emmanuel Macron's frequent, controversial calls for strategic autonomy, the idea that Europe should act as a third superpower, independent of both Washington and Beijing. In our world, these were diplomatic skirmishes, smoothed over by shared values. In this timeline, they were the precursors to a divorce. The pivot point wasn't a military invasion, but an economic betrayal. A series of aggressive American trade laws, massive green energy subsidies, and strict semiconductor export bans began to bleed the European industrial heartland dry. German car manufacturers and French aerospace giants found themselves locked out of the American market, while the U.S. ignored European pleas for a level playing field. In the halls of Brussels, the rhetoric shifted. The United States was no longer the protector of the West. It was a predatory competitor using its dominance to dismantle European prosperity. As a global energy blockade begins to loom, the atmosphere in Europe isn't one of solidarity, but of cold, calculated desperation. The security umbrella is no longer seen as a gift, but as a leash And as the first signs of a hot war flicker in the Persian Gulf, the European leadership decides that the price of the alliance has finally become too high to pay. The transition from allies to rivals is complete, just as the world's most vital resource, oil, is about to be cut off. The spark that ignites the collapse doesn't happen in the North Atlantic, but 6,000 miles away, in the sweltering heat of the Persian Gulf. In a coordinated, lightning-fast operation, a major non-NATO power, emboldened by the growing Western Rift, seizes the Strait of Hormuz. They don't just harass tankers, they lock the world's jugular vein shut with sophisticated sea mines and coastal missile batteries. Overnight, the lifeblood of the global economy is severed. Brent crude, which had been steady at $80 a barrel, rockets to $250. Gas stations across the globe run dry within 48 hours, and the world's stock markets go into a state of cardiac arrest. Washington's response is immediate and traditional. The president invokes the long-standing spirit of the transatlantic alliance, calling for a massive, multinational carrier strike group to break the blockade and restore the freedom of navigation. The Pentagon assumes the British Royal Navy, the French Marine Nationale, and the German Deutsche Marine will fall into formation as they have for decades. But as the American fleet begins its long transit toward the Gulf, the expected confirmation from Europe never arrives. Instead, there is a deafening silence. Then comes the Versailles Declaration. In a historic emergency summit held in the Hall of Mirrors, the same room where the modern world was once mapped out, the leaders of France, Germany, and the European Union stand before a forest of microphones. Their message is a cold, clinical betrayal. They officially refuse to participate in the operation, labeling the crisis a regional dispute fueled by American trade provocations and aggressive economic policies. They argued that Europe cannot risk its own energy security by following Washington into another forever war. For the first time since the end of World War II, the United States is told in no uncertain terms, "You are on your own." The security umbrella hasn't just folded, it has been weaponized as a tool of diplomatic leverage. The American military, designed for decades to operate with the logistical and political support of a dozen allies, suddenly finds itself tactically and strategically isolated. The Great Divorce has moved from the boardroom to the battlefield, and the consequences are about to be written in blood. The Versailles Declaration wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a physical barrier that materialized overnight. At Ramstein Air Base in Germany and RAF Lakenheath in the UK, the beating hearts of American power in Europe, the gears of the world's most formidable logistics machine began to grind to a halt. Citing their new strategic neutrality, local governments imposed unprecedented non-offensive use only restrictions. Suddenly, the very bases the U.S. had built and maintained for 80 years were being treated like foreign embassies under house arrest. The tension on the tarmac was thick enough to choke. Massive C-17 Globemasters, engines idling and laden with vital supplies for the Gulf, were grounded as European air traffic controllers denied them flight paths. The message from Brussels was clear. If the U.S. wanted to fight this war, it wouldn't be doing it from European soil. This logistical strangulation had immediate, lethal consequences. In the Persian Gulf, the U.S. Navy attempted to force the Strait of Hormuz alone. For decades, the Americans had relied on the specialized minesweepers and anti-submarine frigates of their European wingmen to cover their blind spots. Without them, the vulnerability was total. During a frantic midnight transit, a U.S. destroyer, operating without the expected screen of British or French escorts, was swarmed by low-cost kamikaze drones and saturation missile fire. Without the combined electronic warfare capabilities of a full NATO-style fleet, the ship was overwhelmed. The image of the burning hull sinking into the dark waters of the Gulf was broadcast globally in high definition. Over 200 American sailors were lost in a single hour. In Washington, the shock turned into a white-hot bipartisan fury. This wasn't just a diplomatic disagreement anymore. It was a betrayal that had cost American lives. The neutrality era had begun with blood on the floor and the American public watching their sailors die while their allies watched from the sidelines, demanded an end to the charade. The era of the transatlantic alliance didn't just end, it shattered. The images of the burning destroyer in the Gulf were the final straw. In Washington, the shock didn't lead to a plea for reconciliation. It triggered a seismic shift in American foreign policy. Facing a humiliated military and a domestic economy, reeling from the energy blockade, the U.S. president walked into the Oval Office and signed the Atlantic Withdrawal Act. It was the death warrant for the post-war order. The order was absolute. Every American soldier, every airman, and every piece of hardware was to be off European soil within 30 days. What followed was the Great Retreat, a logistical exodus that mirrored the frantic evacuations of the 20th century, but on a continental scale. At Spangdahlem and Aviano, the sights were haunting. Endless lines of C-17S and C-5 Galaxies sat on the tarmac, their cavernous bellies swallowing everything from Abrams tanks to the personal belongings of military families. Schools on base were shuttered mid-lesson. Housing complexes that had hosted American families for generations were vacated in hours, turning thriving communities into silent ghost towns overnight. The American flag was lowered at Ramstein for the last time, not with a ceremony of gratitude, but in a heavy, resentful silence. As the American shield retracted, a wave of pure terror swept through the eastern flank. In Warsaw, Tallinn, and Vilnius, the realization was cold and immediate. For decades, Poland and the Baltics had staked their very existence on the tripwire of American boots on the ground. Now, that wire was being cut. While Paris and Berlin spoke of strategic autonomy, the nations closest to the eastern border saw only a vacuum. They were no longer part of a grand alliance. They were a buffer zone without a guarantor. The departure left Europe physically intact, but strategically hollowed out. The security umbrella hadn't just folded. It had been packed up and flown across the Atlantic, leaving a fractured continent to face an emboldened East alone. The stage was set for a new kind of conflict, one where the weapons weren't just missiles, but the very lifeblood of the global economy. The Great Retreat wasn't just a military maneuver, it was the preamble to a scorched earth economic war. In Washington, the cost of repositioning millions of troops and fortifying the American coastline was astronomical. To pay for this new Fortress America, the president signed an executive order that sent shockwaves through the global markets, a 50% security tariff on all European goods. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. On the trading floors of London and Frankfurt, the euro didn't just fall, it cratered, losing 30% of its value in a single afternoon. For the German automotive industry, the crown jewel of European engineering, the news was a death sentence. Deprived of their largest export market and facing retaliatory logistics costs, the assembly lines in Wolfsburg and Stuttgart ground to a halt. Within months, the giants of the industry, Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes, declared bankruptcy or underwent desperate state nationalization. The economic engine of Europe had seized. But as the lights flickered in the factories, they also began to dim in the homes. With the Persian Gulf blocked and the American energy shield gone, Europe was freezing. Desperation breeds a different kind of betrayal. In a move that horrified the remaining Atlanticists, Brussels and Berlin bypassed their former ally entirely. They signed the Eurasian Energy Accord, a separate peace with the very Eastern powers that had sparked the initial crisis. The terms were brutal and transformative. Europe would trade its most sensitive high-tech machinery, semiconductor equipment, and aerospace patents in exchange for guaranteed shipments of oil and natural gas. The West was no longer a unified front of shared values. It was now two evil economic blocs staring at each other across an Atlantic that had suddenly become a best cold divide. The transition from a security crisis to a total systemic collapse was complete. The world as we knew it was gone, replaced by a landscape of transactional survival where old friends were now the most dangerous of competitors. But as the economic walls went up, the internal foundations of the European project began to crumble from within. For decades, the presence of the American military had acted as a silent mediator, a stabilizing force that suppressed ancient European rivalries by providing a common security floor. Without the American umpire, the ghosts of the past returned to the halls of power in Brussels. The immediate flashpoint was the creation of the European Defense Force. France, possessing the continent's only remaining independent nuclear deterrent and a long expeditionary history, demanded total strategic command. Germany, though its industry was reeling, refused to bankroll a military machine it did not control. The result was not a unified army, but a paralyzed bureaucracy, with Paris and Berlin arguing over command structures while their borders remained unguarded. In Warsaw, Tallinn, and Riga, the Eurasian Energy Accord, the separate peace Berlin and Paris had struck for Eastern gas, was seen for what it truly was, a second betrayal. To the frontline states, strategic autonomy looked like a polite way for Western Europe to sell out the East for warm homes and cheap fuel. Feeling abandoned by old Europe, the Polish and Baltic governments took a desperate, secret gamble. In the dead of night, high-ranking officials bypassed Brussels entirely, opening a clandestine back channel to the White House. They proposed a fortress Eastern Europe, a separate security pact where these nations would voluntarily pay the 50% American security tariffs and host U.S. private military contractors in exchange for a direct, bilateral defense guarantee. The European Union, once the greatest experiment in post-war unity, was now effectively balkanized into competing security camps. The dream of a united Europe didn't die with a bang, but with a series of closed-door deals that turned neighbors into rivals. The continent was no longer a union. It was a collection of fractured states, each looking for a patron to serve in a world that had forgotten how to cooperate. This internal decay left a vacuum that was about to be filled by much more predatory interests. Nature, like geopolitics, abhors a vacuum. With the United States Navy withdrawn to its own coastal bastions and the European Defense Force paralyzed by bureaucratic infighting, the world's most vital maritime arteries were left unguarded. For nearly a century, the blue water had belonged to the West. Now, the gates were wide open, and the wolves were moving in. In the far north, the race for the Arctic, once a carefully managed diplomatic dance, turned into a land grab of historic proportions. Real-world data confirms that as polar ice recedes, the Northern Sea route is becoming the most valuable shipping lane on the planet, capable of shaving weeks off the journey between Asia and Europe. In this timeline, without American icebreakers or carrier groups to challenge the claim, the aggressor powers simply seized it. They declared the entire Arctic a sovereign economic zone, effectively placing a toll booth on the roof of the world. But the true catastrophe for the European project unfolded in the Mediterranean. Historically known as Mare Nostrum, our sea, it was the heart of European trade and the site of the massive Levant Basin gas fields, which held the promise of European energy independence. But without the stabilizing presence of the U.S. Sixth Fleet, the Mediterranean transformed into a closed lake, controlled by non-Western interests. Heavy naval task forces from the east, emboldened by the American retreat, established a permanent security screen stretching from the Suez Canal to the Pillars of Hercules. The irony of strategic neutrality was now bitter and undeniable. To reach their own ports in Marseille, Genoa, or Piraeus, European merchant vessels were forced to stop and submit to inspections by foreign warships. These weren't just security checks, they were exercises in humiliation. Safe passage credits, a polite term for state-sponsored extortion, became the new cost of doing business. Europe had declared neutrality to avoid being dragged into someone else's war. But in doing so, they had surrendered the very thing that makes a nation a power, the ability to move freely across the world. Sovereignty was no longer a right. It was a subscription service they could no longer afford. The continent wasn't just fractured, it was being besieged in slow motion, and the walls were closing in from every direction. As Europe suffocated under the weight of its own independence, the eyes of the world turned back toward the Atlantic, where the final bridge between the old allies was about to be burned. As the Mediterranean became a foreign lake, the United States didn't just watch, it recoiled. In Washington, the Great Betrayal had hardened into a doctrine of absolute clinical isolationism. They called it Fortress America. The Atlantic Ocean, for 80 years, the busiest highway of the Western world, was officially declared a restricted national security zone. The message from the White House was clear. If Europe wanted to trade with America's enemies to survive, they would not do it through American waters. The policy was brutal. Any vessel, regardless of flag, suspected of carrying dual-use technology, semiconductors, aerospace components, or high-grade steel, was now subject to boarding and seizure. The U.S. Navy, once the guarantor of global free trade, became its most formidable gatekeeper. The breaking point came 300 miles off the coast of Ireland. The Cyrano, a French-flagged mega-freighter bound for the east with a cargo of advanced lithography machines, was intercepted by the USS Gerald R. Ford strike group. When the French captain refused to cut his engines, citing strategic neutrality and the freedom of the seas, the response wasn't a diplomatic cable. It was the rhythmic thunder of MH-60 Seahawk helicopters. Grainy, green-tinted night vision footage, leaked to a stunned global audience, showed U.S. Navy SEALs fast roping onto the deck of a ship owned by a fellow NATO founder. For the first time since the 1940s, American boots were on European decks, not as liberators, but as captors. The West was no longer a unified concept. It was a potential combat zone. As French Rafale jets scrambled from mainland bases to shadow the American fleet, the world held its breath. The unthinkable had happened. The two pillars of the democratic world were now locked in a high seas standoff, their sensors tracking one another as hostile. The alliance hadn't just faded, it had curdled into active enmity, and while the former brothers in arms stared each other down across the cold Atlantic waves, the aggressor powers in the East realized that the door to the European heartland wasn't just unlocked, it was ready to be kicked in. While the Atlantic was turning into a frozen front line between former friends, a much older shadow was lengthening across the plains of Eastern Europe. The aggressor powers, watching the West tear itself apart over trade routes and pride, realized the moment they had waited for since 1945 had finally arrived. The security umbrella wasn't just leaking, it had vanished. In the pre-dawn mist of a Tuesday morning, armored columns began to move. They didn't call it an invasion, they called it a peacekeeping stabilization mission. Their target was the Suwalki Gap, a 60-mile strip of land along the Polish-Lithuanian border that represents the only land link between the Baltic states and their European allies. The panic in Brussels was instantaneous. For decades, European security had relied on a tripwire of American troops, and more importantly, the omniscient eyes of American intelligence. Now, as the tanks rolled, the screens in the European Situation Room went dark. Desperate calls were placed to the Pentagon, begging for real-time satellite imagery and signals intelligence. The response from Washington was a cold, automated silence, followed by a formal cable that sent shivers through the halls of the EU. Access denied. National assets are reserved for the defense of the American homeland. Without the U.S. to bridge the gap, the European Defense Force was exposed for what it truly was, a paper tiger. As a small-scale border skirmish erupted in a quiet Lithuanian village, the response wasn't a counterattack, it was a debate. In Paris and Berlin, politicians argued over the legal definition of intervention. Was this an Article 4 situation or an Article 5? Did a peacekeeping move count as an act of war? While the lawyers and diplomats in Brussels argued over the wording of a formal protest, the reality on the ground was being written in steel and fire. A battalion of Lithuanian border guards realizing no one was coming to save them, fought a desperate, lonely rearguard action against an overwhelming force. Their pleas for air support went unanswered because the European command couldn't agree on who had the authority to authorize a strike. By sunset, the Suwalki Gap was closed. The Baltic states were effectively severed from the rest of the continent. A piece of European territory had been annexed in real time, broadcast on social media to a horrified world, while the Allies were still debating the agenda of their emergency summit. The physical cost of the strategic neutrality was now measured in lost sovereignty and the smoke rising from occupied towns. The Iron Curtain hadn't just returned, it had been slammed shut, and this time there was no one on the other side of the ocean willing to help pull it back up. The era of European peace was over, and the long, cold winter was just beginning. As the smoke cleared over the Suwalki Gap, a different kind of fire began to consume the heart of Europe, a financial inferno. For nearly a century, the euro and the European economy had floated on a sea of stability guaranteed by the American security umbrella. But with that umbrella folded and the East moving into the Baltics, investor confidence didn't just dip, it evaporated. The euro, once the world's second reserve currency, went into a terminal tailspin. Without the U.S. Federal Reserve acting as a backstop, and with global trade routes paralyzed by the American blockade, the European dream of borderless prosperity collapsed into a breadline reality. In the grocery stores of Berlin and Madrid, prices changed not by the day, but by the hour. Hyperinflation, a ghost of the 20th century, returned with a vengeance, turning life savings into worthless scraps of paper overnight. The visuals of this economic winter are haunting. Imagine the city of light, Paris, plunged into literal darkness as energy rationing turns the Eiffel Tower into a silent iron skeleton. Imagine the grand plazas of Rome not filled with tourists, but with the desperate and the angry, with the flow of affordable energy cut off and the American market slammed shut by 50% tariffs. The industrial engines of Germany and Italy simply ceased to hum. In this vacuum of misery, the center could not hold. Radical political movements, some echoing the darkest chapters of the 1930s, began to seize the narrative. In the streets of Brussels and Athens, the chant wasn't for unity, but for survival. The Versailles Declaration of Neutrality, once hailed as a masterstroke of sovereignty, was now cursed as a suicide note. Across the Atlantic, the contrast was jarring. The United States had retreated into a state of militant autarky. Washington had successfully decoupled from the global system, using its massive domestic resources and a mobilized military to ensure its own survival. America was prosperous, yes. Its shelves were full and its factories were running, but it had become a paranoid, isolated fortress. The American public, fueled by a sense of betrayal and a never-again mentality, supported a government that viewed every foreign ship as a threat and every former ally as a competitor. The U.S. was no longer the leader of the free world. It was a lone wolf with a nuclear arsenal, watching the collapse of Europe from behind a wall of steel and high-tech sensors. The two pillars of Western civilization were no longer speaking. They were staring at each other across an ocean that had become a no-man's land. The Great Schism was complete. One side was starving in the dark, and the other was thriving in a cage of its own making. And as the winter deepened, the tension between the two was reaching a breaking point that no diplomat could bridge. The cold, steel-gray waters of the North Sea are no longer a highway for commerce. They have become a front line. A U.S. Navy Freedom of Navigation patrol led by the USS Winston S. Churchill, a name now dripping with bitter irony, cuts through the heavy swells, asserting Washington's right to police the Atlantic. But as the American warships approach the entrance to the English Channel, they find the horizon crowded not by enemies, but by ghosts of their own past. Facing them is the sovereignty fleet of the newly formed European Defense Force. For the first time in nearly a century, American fire control radars are not scanning for Russian or Chinese signatures. They are locked onto the sleek hulls of French frigates and the advanced sensors of German destroyers. In the combat information centers of these multi-billion-dollar machines, the silence is deafening. Every officer on both sides knows the names of the men they are targeting. They have trained together at Annapolis and St. Cyr. They have shared meals in Mediterranean ports and stood watch together in the Hindu Kush. Now, they are seconds away from an fratricidal apocalypse. The tension reaches a breaking point as the electronic warfare suites scream, a lock-on warning. Missiles are fueled, tubes are flooded. Then the red phone rings. In a world of total diplomatic silence, the direct line between the White House and the European Council crackles to life for the first time in months. But there is no talk of compromise, no mention of the shared history of Lafayette or the blood spilled on the beaches of Normandy. The voice from Washington is cold, devoid of the warmth of a former ally. It is not a plea for peace, but a final, brutal warning: clear the lane, or we will open fire. You have 60 seconds to choose between your strategic autonomy and your existence. This is the ultimate payoff of the Great Schism. The two pillars of Western civilization, the very architects of the modern world, are no longer looking at an external aggressor. They are looking at each other through the crosshairs of a missile battery. The dark timeline has reached its peak. A world where the West didn't just fail to hold, it decided to destroy itself. The betrayal is no longer a matter of trade or treaties. It is a finger hovering over a launch button, ready to extinguish the last remnants of the Atlantic Alliance in a flash of sea-skimming fire. The 60 seconds of that ultimatum pass in a silence that echoes across the globe. Whether the missiles fly or the ships turn back in that moment, the damage is already absolute. The map of the world has been redrawn, not by conquest, but by collapse. We are left with three hostile, impoverished blocks, each a mirror of the other's paranoia. To the west, the American fortress, resource-rich but spiritually isolated. A nation that has traded its role as a global leader for that of a planetary warden, patrolling its own borders with a cold, unforgiving eye. To the east, the ascendant powers, who watched the Atlantic Alliance cannibalize itself and simply moved in to collect the spoils of a leaderless world. And in the middle, a fractured Europe, a collection of states once united by a grand dream, now divided by the bitter, cold reality of survival. The era of global trade is over. The era of the great hunger has begun. This is the true cost of the Great Schism. We are witnessing the death of the global middle class, a casualty not of a foreign invasion, but of a domestic divorce. A single moment of strategic neutrality, that initial refusal to stand by an ally in the Persian Gulf, didn't just save Europe from a regional conflict, it condemned the entire planet to a century of poverty and shadow. The long peace, that 80-year anomaly of human history where commerce superseded tribalism, has been dismantled. It didn't take a nuclear exchange to end the modern world. It only took a phone call that went unanswered. This is the peak of the darkness, a world where the light of the West didn't go out because of an external enemy, but because we simply stopped holding the torch for one another. The pillars have fallen, and the roof of the world has come crashing down. But let's step back from the edge of the abyss. This nightmare of fractured trade, empty supermarket shelves, and naval standoffs is, for now, a fever dream, a simulation of what happens when the geopolitical duct tape finally fails. In our world, the transatlantic relationship has been anything but smooth, yet it has never truly broken. Real history is a catalog of friction, not a fairy tale of perfect harmony. In 1956, during the Suez Crisis, the United States actively pressured its closest allies, Britain and France, to retreat from Egypt, going so far as to threaten the collapse of the British pound. In 2003, the invasion of Iraq saw a bitter public split between Washington and the old Europe of Paris and Berlin, leading to some of the worst diplomatic vitriol in decades. More recently, the NATO summits of 2017 and beyond were defined by blunt demands for increased defense spending and open questioning of the alliance's very purpose. To the casual observer, these moments looked like the beginning of the end. But behind the heated rhetoric and the podium pounding, a different story was being written. In quiet rooms in Brussels and secure basements in D.C., the boring work of diplomacy never stopped. Career officials, military liaisons, and trade envoys continued the invisible labor of keeping the lights on. They understood a truth that our fictional timeline forgot, that the security umbrella isn't a gift or a favor, it's a mutual insurance policy against a return to the chaos of the 19th century. In our reality, despite the shouting, the intelligence sharing continues. The joint exercises go on. The cables remain connected. It is this unglamorous, often frustrating process of compromise that prevents the cinematic nightmare we just witnessed. We live in a world where the phone call is almost always answered, not because of perfect friendship, but because both sides know that the alternative is a darkness no one can afford. The boring diplomacy of our world is the only thing standing between us and the Great Schism. Look at the horizon once more. In our reality, the USS Gerald R. Ford is not a ghost ship haunting a darkened sea. It is the centerpiece of a multinational armada. To its port side sits a British Type 45 destroyer. To its starboard, a French Frem frigate. Above them, the sky is filled with the roar of joint sorties, not a prelude to war, but a rehearsal for a peace that has lasted generations. This is the visual reality of the alliance, a complex, synchronized dance of steel and sovereignty that keeps the global commons open for everyone. We often mistake the transatlantic relationship for a mere friendship, something subject to the personal whims of whoever sits in the Oval Office or the Élysée Palace. But it is far more than a handshake. It is the structural engineering of the modern world. It is the plumbing of global trade, the electricity of international law, and the shield that keeps the ghosts of the 20th century at bay. It is a messy, expensive, and often infuriating machine, but it is the machine that allows a smartphone designed in California to be assembled with parts from across the globe and shipped safely to a port in Hamburg. Our journey through the Great Schism shows us a world where that machine is dismantled, a world where every nation becomes an island, every sea becomes a graveyard for commerce, and every supermarket shelf eventually goes bare. We've seen the dark timeline, and it serves as a stark reminder that the stability we take for granted is not the natural state of human affairs. It is an artificial construction, a choice made every single day by thousands of diplomats, sailors, and citizens who decide that the frustrations of collaboration are infinitely better than the horrors of catastrophe. In the end, we often complain about our allies. We argue over defense budgets, we bicker over trade deficits, and we chafe at the compromises required to keep the engine running. But as we have seen in this dark reflection of history, we must realize one fundamental, unshakable truth. The only thing worse than having allies you disagree with is having no allies at all. As the sun sets over the real-world Atlantic, the alliance remains intact, the cables are still humming, and the phone calls are still being answered. But as geopolitical tensions rise in our own era, the question remains more relevant than ever. Is the cost of this security umbrella, the billions in spending and the complex diplomatic knots, still worth the price of entry? Or are we closer to the Great Schism than we'd like to admit? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Is the era of the great alliances coming to an end, or is it the only thing keeping us from the brink? If you found this exploration of the dark timeline thought-provoking, hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the high-stakes what-ifs of our world. Until next time, remember, history is written by those who show up, but it is preserved by those who stand together. Thank you for watching.